Excellent. Okay, so with a thought process around the big challenges in life, questions for the panel across this whole innovation space, digital economy.
Hi, Bill Cayley from International Information Security Consultants here on the Gold Coast. Been here about 33 years now. Quick one. We move to open data, but we must trust it. You must likely have heard Wednesday of this week in America, Anonymous have declared Attack Data Day for Wednesday of this week. It'll be Thursday our time, but Anonymous have said the aim is to disrupt open data and to disrupt services into United States government electronic services. So maybe you could ask the panel, particularly maybe Di, if we have open data, for example, take that Western Australia case, it's critical that we have integrity on the data itself. So maybe we have to look at how we make sure that the data we get is correct, hasn't been tampered with, okay, and is actually as it was put there, okay? So integrity is critical, but I haven't heard it at all anywhere. Number two, denial of service. Once we move to this situation, then the simplest thing to do, for example, in that building approvals, I want to disrupt systems, I want to get my application going, I'll simply disrupt the service, I'll deny service to it. So lo and behold, we saw what happened in Estonia a few years ago with Tallinn. What happened there? The whole of the government system was turned off for over 2 weeks by denial of service. So 2 points. One, open data, integrity and trust is critical. Number two, denial of service. How do we address that?
I'm going to break those two questions across the panel. So perhaps firstly, Andrew, if you'd like to respond about the integrity of data and the whole thing around crowdsourcing data accuracy, and perhaps Di, you might like to talk about more from the government perspective, and then Ricky, if you want to hone on denial of service. I think that might be best use of resources on the panel.
Bill, thanks for the question. Thanks for a tough question. But I think it's a very valid one to ask. I guess the only comments that I'd probably make are that there have been mechanisms in place, and we talked about some of those earlier, over the break, that don't necessarily seem to have been implemented by many organisations, that allow for that, or basically authorise or determine who is who. I guess the other component to it, which we're seeing a bit of, is that the feedback mechanisms that exist do allow for some level of self-validation. I mean, it's like how many students are going out there on the internet right now and looking for information for their assignments and all the rest of it. How do they determine that the information that they have is actually valid? So they're making some judgment calls about that. So I think there is a potential for some mechanism of feedback. There are going to be some nefarious people out there, and that's going to increase. And we've seen some, I guess the antivirus vendors are talking about that. The latest stuff was, how many emails that were going around to, click on this link, on the Pope's election and all this sort of stuff. It's like take an event like that and suddenly, start publicising it and use it as a means of payloading some bogus information as well. I don't have a short answer for it. I think there's a possibility of self-correcting some of that data, and I think big data as a potential to aggregate and I guess validate some of it as well. But that's about as good as I can get.
I guess there's also the thing that if councils publish data on where the toilets are, and the toilets that's being published is actually 200 metres to the left, very quickly the SIT industry is going to say, excuse me, could you just move that 200 metres to the left, and then we're all okay. So,
interesting question, Bill, because there's probably been a lot of challenging conversations that I've been involved with over the last couple of years internally at a council level in terms of the whole concept of open data and how it can be used. And there's obviously been a bit of a journey in terms of educating and talking through the benefits and the opportunities that it actually allows for, because obviously government are historically quite inwardly looking just in terms of the management and control, and there is that control factor within what should be allowed to be out there in the open public arena and what shouldn't, and what dangers that can pose. So there's been a lot of conversations, and it's probably only really been in the last sort of 6 to 8 months, I'd say, where there's been a real embracing of what the opportunities actually can give to the council, particularly when we've been able to articulate it, I suppose, from an economic opportunity and a business opportunity. And if we really truly are a city that's intending on being a world leader in certain areas and trying to be recognised globally, that we're being left behind at a rapid pace. And it's being able to talk through those anecdotal and evidence-based stories from a global perspective with political leaders, at a council level, with other internal office areas, particularly obviously areas that control that data, who are very scared about how it's going to be used, and just in terms of being able to run pilots, the ones that we've been running with Microsoft and with the Future Cities Institute in terms of development of a recent BICAP, and just actually being able to show how that it is in the public's interest to put correct data in, and crowdsourcing can be effective when the people using it have that buy-in and ownership of how it's going to be used, and so they want it to be seen to be effective, and it's a personal interest. So I think we've moved on quite considerably over the last 12 months in terms of being able to embrace that there is some control around it, and that it can be put out there, and it's still a controllable means. It's just being used in a much more productive manner.
Hi Bill, thanks for your question. Just to quickly touch on the integrity issue and the tampering one. You're right, I don't know of any open data initiative out there at the moment that is thinking about tampering of data, but one solution could be copied from the open source community, right, where they fingerprint any binaries that you download. Is that the sort of thing that you were? Yep. Right, and on the denial of service issue, so my experience helping to roll out the Queensland Open Data Portal, denial of service and that side of security was one thing that they were really, really thorough with, and it's one of the reasons we couldn't roll the thing out even faster than they did, right? They had external consultancies come in, run very thorough tests on that. I can't speak for other jurisdictions, but I can say here in Queensland they had that part of it well and truly covered, I guess because of the embarrassment factor, right?
Thanks for the question. I've been involved in publishing local government data now for about 11 years on the web. So it's interesting even now after all that time, and there's kind of a pseudo industry standard of putting that information out there, that we'll go and do a presentation to a council and we're still getting the same questions 11 years after we've started publishing this data. And it's generally, there's a commonly used frame, it's the STPs that cause the problem. And the STPs are the same 10 people that complain about everything. So generally they're the ones who actually make councils very nervous about publishing content. We also call them the Get a Life group because they've got to get a life. And nobody has died in the streets from DA tracking. We know that for a fact. And once you put that service out there, we've had councils that have gone from 9,000 phone calls coming into their call centre a month to 3,000. So really the community demand that information is out there, and they wouldn't allow a council to actually take that service offline. So it needs to be available.
Well done, right? Excellent. Yes, I'm going to steal that, same 10 people. STPs. Next question from the audience. David.
Yeah, hi, it's David Ives here from Council. I've got a question for Ricky. It's about big data, and it sort of relates to the name, the big part. So if you're trying to develop big data and analytics as a skill and as a process, one of the issues is you can't really run small pilot projects fairly easily. So I'm just wondering, if you know of any ways to simplify it a little bit and be able to do a big data project in a small way, because we've had some discussions about it, and so far we've found it difficult to find a way of doing it on a small scale.
Thanks for your question. So I guess I like to talk about any data. It can be big, it can be small. You know, the techniques often apply to big and small data. A potential, I don't know, a solution, I guess, if you're wanting to run a test on an actual big data set, is that we're seeing groups start up in Queensland and Victoria and New South Wales and elsewhere for the university sector, so people like QSIF, Intersect, Nectar, where they are like a cloud computing environment that hosts public sector data for the use of researchers. So if there was a way for others to tap into that, to tap into those resources by partnering or whatever, that could be a solution to your problem, right? Because there they have actual real, you know, petabytes of geospatial data and other data sets.
I guess just quickly, I saw a wonderful example of small big data out in Stockholm. So they had this initiative around bikes in the city, and they had this self-powered bike. And of course, because it was self-powered, you could actually put electronics on it, and they actually put these little electronic sensors on it, like CO2 emissions, etc. So previously, they had these big, expensive sensors on the top of the buildings to actually measure the air quality. And of course, they were very accurate. And then when they were on the bikes, they wound up with a whole lot of sensors that weren't as accurate, but there was more of them. And they mapped this out across the city with the people on the bikes and the bike couriers, etc. They found that they actually got better results because rather than being on the top of the building, it was actually at street level, and they could actually see the canyon effect of the CO2 emissions. And that was only on a small scale. But of course, if you did that, the other one was MIT has done drought in Spain using Facebook. So they download the photos in Facebook from Spain, run an algorithm to see whether it's green or brown. You know, in terms of, you know, that's a landscape, is it green or brown? They could actually quite accurately track through Facebook photos the progression of the drought through Spain.
It wasn't drought, it was potatoes.
Was it potatoes? Okay, yeah. Anyway, cool stuff. Another question from the audience?
Ben Payes from Birchman in Queensland. I guess the first comment, big data and the impact on our society and everything else, I can only see opportunity. Exactly where that opportunity goes into the future, it's hard to determine at this point in time. No doubt it'll also have an impact on the shape of policy, government policies in the future. Some of it we can see now and predict what the impact of that will be. In other cases, we won't be able to until some of the security issues or whatever it is in the courier mail tomorrow is going to determine what the policy is. I'm interested in the panel's views in terms of how policy will attempt to keep up with some of these changes as big data matures.
Big data and policy.
Ben, I think it's a good question. If I'll just touch on David's comment before. I'll go out on a limb here, but it relates to what you're talking about as well. I'm not so sure that it's too challenging to do smaller big data projects. I think the issue is how, you know, what you're trying to achieve. To Hugh's point this morning, it's about looking forward, about, you know, better service delivery and you know, those sorts of aspects, or what you're trying to achieve. And there are a variety of data sources around that exist out there, and these are not necessarily big data in terms of terabytes or exabytes worth of data. These are sources of data. I mean, if you think about the average salesperson that walks through the door, they're experts on, you know, on a micro level of big data. They're aggregating all sorts of information to determine what their customers actually want, including reading the sign-in ledgers and all the rest of it to see who's been in there beforehand. So in terms of the policy frameworks around that, I think a lot of those, when you start to look at some of the data sources that you're likely to be using both within government and external to government, some of those may also be external to government sources. Whether they're vendors that the government is using that are providing some of the data services, or whether it's some of the social networking components that maybe are validating the data or feeding some of the data in there that you're going to be cross-referencing. I think we've dealt with some of those already. There's certainly a policy issue, perhaps in terms of, the validation of the data and whether we need to Marie's point, whether you need to worry too much about that side of things. So I think that there's a little bit of work to be perhaps done in that, but I don't know that you necessarily need to worry too much about policy issues in relation to big data, because I think to Marie's point, it's just go out and do it. It'll fix itself on the way. My comment. So
it's interesting because when we think of policy, we think of a book or a Word document, or somebody's written something down. What I would see as a real opportunity is that policy is created as electronic content. Because if you're developing a property here in Queensland, there's actually 152 pieces of legislation that could affect you developing on that property. All of that legislation right now is a PDF, it's a Word document, it's static content. You can't interrogate it, you can't link it to any spatial information other than it being a PDF. So I think policy has to go right back to the beginning and actually become electronic content, not policy, in a policy framework. And we see that as a critical issue in terms of being able to take what the open data framework in Queensland has delivered and actually link it to relevant pieces of information that affect me as a property owner. So if I want to develop a nuclear power station on my property, I might have 152 pieces of legislation I have to go and read before I even start considering what I'm going to do. But if I had that electronically and I could link it spatially to my property, I could have the system come back to me and say, actually, it's only 35 of those pieces of legislation that affect you today, so don't bother reading the other bits. I think open data from our point of view is really key. When I think of the websites out there like realestate.com or RP Data that give us a summary of our suburb, I'd love to know that if I'm going to purchase this property, can I subdivide it? But at the moment, those pieces of data are not available other than being written in a council planning scheme. That is static content because it's PDF. That's my view.
I'm not sure I can add too much more to that. I agree completely. But just going back to something in my presentation, that rigorous tool, right, is designed for automating that whole compliance aspect. So there's a certain policy you've got to comply with. If you can represent that in the form that it requires, and you can monitor your own business processes, this will tell you, are your business processes conformant to this piece of policy, and am I complying in real time? But yeah, I'm not sure that there are any sort of specific policies that government need in terms of big data. Okay, it's data, and yeah, not too much more to add.
I think I would just add, just in terms of policy in general at a government level, I think it'll just open up the ability for policy to be citizen-driven rather than being thought of somewhere in a silo and developed, and as Marie mentioned, then it becomes a document and it's very bureaucratic. And I think that the whole approach to open data and its availability and the fact that things will be shaped and driven and transparent will enable government to It'll almost be taking a completely different role in terms of policy development, because it'll be actually the community and the citizens that will shape and drive that, and government will have to see a way of changing within that environment from being something quite silo operational to something that's quite transparent and open.
I get one thing that strikes me about today and open data and policy, etc., is the policies can be written by local government or central government, but they're also being rewritten by the citizens. And how many people here have heard of Mohammed Bouazizi? So Mohammed was the street vendor that got his cart taken away from him in Tunisia by a female police officer and put himself alight and sparked the very velvet glove uprising in Tunisia and completely reshaped the Tunisian society. But that happened because of Facebook. You know, the citizens rose up and said, actually, this is not good enough, you know, and they changed the policy, they changed the government. I think that's what we're getting around with this new world and the open data and social networking is, it's not about central or local government being the sole purveyors of policy. It's now communities which are driving the policy, which comes back to actually making it accessible and etc. So, do we have another question from the audience? Okay, well, I'd like to thank our panel very much for their time. And we have pretty much finished on time, which is great. Now, we've got the networking function at 5 o'clock.